They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes all it takes is one scorching hot reply all to burn down an empire. Martin Keaton thought he was untouchable, a CFO with a $15 million deal in his pocket and the power to crush anyone beneath him. He crushed me first. What he didn't know was that I'd already lit the fuse. His own arrogance would pull the trigger, and when the smoke cleared, I'd be standing in his corner office while he'd be updating his LinkedIn status to seeking new opportunities. My name is Claire Donovan, and I've spent 12 years climbing the ladder at Northwind Strategies, one of those gleaming financial consulting firms where the coffee costs $18 a pound and everyone's watch could fund a small startup. I'd earned my stripes analyzing risk for Fortune 500 companies, turning their financial nightmares into digestible PowerPoints that somehow made board members sleep better at night. Senior Director of Financial Analysis, the title that took me through 3 recessions, 2 mergers, and more all-nighters than I care to count. The morning Martin Keaton walked into our executive conference room as our new CFO. I knew trouble had arrived wearing a $5,000 Armani suit. He had that particular swagger of men who failed upward their entire careers, mistaking luck for talent and connections for competence. Silver-haired, early 50s, with the kind of tan that screamed golf course deals rather than actual work. "Let's shake things up around here," he announced during his first all-hands meeting, his eyes scanning the room like a predator marking territory. "I see a lot of legacy thinking that needs modernizing." Legacy thinking. That's what he called the methodology I developed that had saved our clients a combined $200 million over the past 5 years. I sat 3 seats down from him, my notebook open, pen poised, playing the part of the attentive senior director while mentally cataloging every piece of bullshit flowing from his mouth. The real reveal came 2 weeks later during the quarterly review. I was presenting our risk assessment framework for the Helios Capital Engagement, our most lucrative client, worth $15 million annually to Northwind. I'd spent 6 weeks perfecting the analysis, identifying 3 critical vulnerabilities in their proposed expansion strategy that could cost them tens of millions if ignored. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Martin interrupted me mid-slide, actually standing up to commandeer my presentation. "Too conservative, too focused on what could go wrong instead of what could go right." He clicked past my carefully constructed risk matrices like they were vacation photos. "Claire, how long have you been doing this?" 12 years with Northwind, 20 in the industry," I replied, keeping my voice steady as silk. "Maybe that's the problem," he said, turning to address the room while I still stood at the front like a dismissed student. "Sometimes experience becomes baggage. We need fresh eyes on Helios." Fresh eyes. His eyes. He meant eyes that had never actually read a complete earnings report, based on the questions he'd been asking in our prep meetings. Richard, our CEO, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Jennifer from legal looked down at her phone. Tom from strategy suddenly found his coffee fascinating. "I'll be taking point on the Helios presentation myself," Martin continued, finally acknowledging my existence with a dismissive wave. "Claire, you can support with the data cleanup." Data cleanup. I'd just been demoted from architect to janitor in front of the entire leadership team. I gathered my materials slowly, deliberately, making eye contact with each person in the room. Most looked away. Only Sandra from HR held my gaze, her expression a mixture of sympathy and warning. "Don't make waves," it said. "Play the game." "Of course," I said, my smile sharp enough to cut glass. "I'll make sure you have everything you need." As I walked back to my office, heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer, I heard Martin's voice booming behind me. "This is how we transform Northwind. Bold thinking, aggressive strategies. None of this hand-wringing about every little risk." I closed my door quietly and sat at my desk, staring at the Helios folder on my screen. 20 years in this industry had taught me patience. It had also taught me that men like Martin Keaton always make one fatal mistake: they assume everyone else is as stupid as they think we are. I opened a new folder on my personal drive and began making copies of everything. Every analysis, every email, every timestamp showing when documents were created and by whom. Martin wanted to play games fine, but he'd chosen the wrong opponent. I hadn't survived 2 decades in financial consulting by rolling over when some overconfident fool tried to steamroll me. That afternoon, I heard him laughing in the hallway with a cluster of junior analysts, the ones hungry enough to attach themselves to any executive who might fast-track their careers. "Sometimes you need to clear out the old wood to let the forest grow," he said, loud enough for everyone on the floor to hear. Old wood. I saved another file, labeled it with today's date, and started planning my next move. Martin Keaton had just made his first mistake. He'd underestimated me. It wouldn't be his last, but it would be the one he'd remember most when everything came crashing down. The transformation of my Helios capital analysis happened over a single weekend. I watched it unfold through the document's revision history like watching someone take a Monet and paint over it with house paint. Martin had gone in with his digital machete, slashing through my carefully constructed warnings, replacing cautious projections with numbers that belonged in a fantasy novel rather than a financial report. Where I'd written 15 to 18% ROI with substantial market volatility risk, he'd inserted 25-30% guaranteed returns. Where I'd flagged regulatory concerns about their expansion into European markets, he'd deleted the entire section and replaced it with a single line, "Negligible regulatory overhead expected." It was financial malpractice dressed up as optimism. Monday morning, I received an email that made my blood run cold and hot simultaneously. "Claire, need you to clean up the formatting on the Helios deck. Make it pop. Add some graphics. Make the numbers easier to digest. Thanks. MK." Make it pop. This wasn't analysis anymore. It was fiction. But I did exactly as asked. I made it pop with perfect formatting, gorgeous charts, and those inflated numbers displayed in bold, confident fonts. I also kept my original version, complete with timestamps, methodology notes, and email chains showing my concerns, every breadcrumb that would lead back to the truth. The worst part came Wednesday during our team meeting. Martin stood at the whiteboard, drawing circles and arrows like a football coach planning plays. "The old guard in this industry," he said, his marker squeaking against the board. "They're paralyzed by fear. Every opportunity looks like a threat to them. That's why companies like Northwind get stuck in neutral." Jessica, one of my junior analysts who'd worked with me for 3 years, raised her hand tentatively. "But shouldn't we include some risk disclaimers Claire always taught us?" "Claire's methods are exactly what I'm talking about." Martin cut her off, and I watched Jessica shrink into her chair. "We're not in the business of scaring clients. We're in the business of making them money." I sat silent, taking notes that had nothing to do with his presentation. Instead, I was documenting every word, every dismissal of standard risk protocols. The legal implications alone would be staggering if Helios acted on his recommendations and lost money. That afternoon, I ran into David from compliance in the elevator. He looked exhausted, stress etched into the lines around his eyes. "Claire," he said quietly, glancing around the empty elevator, "I've been reviewing the Helios materials. This isn't what you submitted originally, is it?" I met his eyes steadily. "All my original work is thoroughly documented and saved, with timestamps." He nodded slowly, understanding passing between us. "Good. That's good to know." Thursday brought another twist. Martin called me into his office, all smiles and artificial warmth. His desk was obscenely clean, no papers, no files, just a single monitor and a photograph of himself shaking hands with someone who looked important. "Claire, I want you to know I value your experience," he began, and I knew immediately this was going somewhere awful. "But I think you'd be happier in a less client-facing role. Maybe something in our internal audit division, less pressure, more stable hours, better for someone at your stage of career." Your stage, like I was a disease in remission. "I'm perfectly happy with my current position," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "My client relationships are strong. Dana Whitmore at Helios specifically requested my involvement in their account." His jaw tightened at Dana's name. "Yes, well, relationships change. Business evolves. I'll be managing the Helios relationship directly from now on. You'll transition your contacts to me by end of week." "Of course," I said, standing to leave. "I'll prepare a full transition document. Every contact, every conversation, every concern they've raised, all thoroughly documented. The threat in my words was subtle, but his eyes narrowed. He knew I was keeping records. He just didn't know how comprehensive they were. That evening, I worked late, officially preparing transition documents. Unofficially, I was creating a complete parallel record of everything: the real analysis, his changes, the email chains, the compliance concerns David had raised. I uploaded it all to my personal cloud storage, then created a physical backup on a drive I kept in my purse. Around 9 p.m., I heard voices from Martin's office. He was on speaker with someone, probably thinking the floor was empty. "The old guard needs to understand their time is over," he said, laughing. "Especially the women who think their experience means something. They need to learn when it's time to step aside gracefully." I stood in the hallway, listening, recording on my phone. Every word another nail in a coffin he was building for himself without realizing it. "Don't worry about the Helios deal," he continued. "Once I present these numbers, they'll be eating out of our hands. Claire's conservative projections would have cost us millions in fees. Sometimes you have to be creative with the truth." Creative with the truth, I saved the recording, backed it up, and walked past his office just loudly enough for him to know someone was there. His door slammed shut moments later. That night, I went home and poured myself a glass of wine. Staring at the city lights from my apartment window, Martin thought he was pushing me out, boxing me into a corner where I'd either quit or accept his demotion quietly. He had no idea that every move he made was being documented, every word recorded, every lie preserved for posterity. The Helios presentation was in 1 week. Martin would stand in front of Dana Whitmore and her team, presenting my work butchered beyond recognition, numbers inflated to the point of fraud, risks hidden like landmines under a manicured lawn. And I would be there, silent and supportive, the perfect picture of a defeated subordinate. Right until the moment everything exploded, Dana Whitmore and I went back 15 years, to when she was a rising star at Goldman, and I was cutting my teeth at a boutique firm that Goldman eventually devoured. We'd stayed in touch through career moves, market crashes, and her meteoric rise to CFO of Helios Capital. She was brilliant, ruthless when necessary, and had a bullshit detector that could sense fabrication from 3 states away. Which is why Martin's plan to dazzle her with inflated projections was like watching someone prepare to juggle flaming chainsaws while blindfolded. I hadn't reached out to Dana directly about the situation; that would have been too obvious, too traceable. But Dana and I had developed our own language over the years, subtle signals in a world where information was currency and trust was everything. The Friday before the presentation, she texted me from her personal phone. "Lunch Tuesday after our meeting, been too long." I responded, "Would love to, but I won't be in the presentation. Martin's running point solo." 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before her response. "Interesting. He specifically told me you'd co-present." "Change of plans. I'm on data support now." I paused, then added, "Behind the scenes." "I see." 2 words that carried volumes. Saturday evening, I was reviewing Martin's final deck at home when another text came through. "Claire, I'm looking at the advanced materials. These numbers seem optimistic." I stared at my phone for a full minute, choosing my words carefully. Martin has a very aggressive vision for growth. "Your analysis was always more thorough." I wasn't allowed to review the final deck. Expect polish over substance. There it was, not quite whistleblowing, not quite sabotage, just a professional heads-up between colleagues. Dana would know exactly what I meant. She'd seen this play before new executive comes in, inflates projections to look like a hero, hopes to cash out before reality catches up. Sunday was quiet. I spent it organizing my files, creating multiple backups, and preparing for what I knew was coming. Martin had sent a group email that morning, all enthusiasm and military metaphors. "Team, tomorrow we take the hill. The Helios presentation will show everyone what the new north wind is capable of." Monday arrived gray and drizzling, pathetic fallacy at its finest. I dressed carefully, my best suit, but understated, present but invisible, exactly how Martin wanted me. I arrived early, made coffee, and settled into my office to watch the disaster unfold from a safe distance. Martin strutted past my door at 8 a.m., garment bag over his shoulder. "Big day. Claire, sure you don't want to come watch and learn something?" "I'll be here if you need anything," I replied. turning back to my monitor where I had the real Helios analysis open. Good luck? He laughed. Don't need luck when you have vision. At 9:45, the Helios team arrived. I watched from my window as Dana emerged from a black town car, her expression neutral as Switzerland. She was accompanied by her senior team, Thomas Park, their head of strategic investments, whom I'd worked with on 3 previous deals, Sarah Martinez, their chief risk officer, who had once told me she trusted my analyses more than her own team's, and surprisingly, James Worthington, Helios's chief legal counsel. You don't bring your chief lawyer to a routine quarterly presentation unless you're expecting trouble. I sent Martin a helpful text. Saw the Helios team arrive. James Worthington is with them, unusual for a standard presentation. His response was predictably dismissive. Good. More people to impress. At 10 a.m., they filed into our main conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see Martin holding court, all grand gestures and animated expressions. Dana sat perfectly still, her face giving away nothing. Sarah was taking extensive notes. James hadn't even opened his laptop. At 10:47, my phone buzzed. A text from Jessica, who was in the room as note-taker. He just promised 30% returns. Dana asked for supporting data. He said trust him. Trust him. In a room full of people who dealt in data, proof, and documented projections, he'd asked them to trust him. At 11:15, another text from Jessica. Sarah asking about risk mitigation. He just said, fortune favors the bold. Thomas actually laughed. Not in a good way. At 11:32, Dana asked specifically about regulatory challenges in EU markets. Martin said you hadn't flagged any. Dana said Claire always flags regulatory issues. Always. And there it was. Martin had just lied about my work directly to someone who knew my methods better than he knew his own inflated numbers. I saved Jessica's texts, adding them to my growing archive. At 11:45, the meeting ended, through the glass. I watched the Helios team gather their things with the kind of deliberate movements that suggested controlled displeasure. Dana shook Martin's hand, her smile not reaching her eyes. As they walked past my office, she glanced in, making eye contact for just a moment. The look said everything I know what just happened here. Martin, oblivious to the undercurrents, strutted back to his office like a conquering hero. 20 minutes later, he sent a company-wide email. Team, fantastic meeting with Helios. They were thoroughly impressed with our new direction. Expect big things. I read it twice, saved it, then returned to my real work. The fuse was lit. Martin just didn't know it yet. He'd walked into that room thinking he was the smartest person there, not realizing that everyone else had already seen through his facade. Dana would go back to her office, confer with her team, and start asking questions that would lead to more questions, which would lead to requests for documentation that Martin couldn't provide because he'd built his house on sand. My phone lit up with a text from Dana. That was illuminating. We need to discuss risk assessment. I'll be in touch with Richard directly. Richard, our CEO, not Martin. I smiled, closed my laptop, and decided to take an early lunch. The wheels were in motion now, and sometimes the best strategy is to simply step back and let gravity do its work. Martin had pushed the boulder up the hill all by himself. I didn't need to be there when it started rolling back down. But I'd definitely be watching. The Helios headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of a glass tower that seemed to pierce the Manhattan sky like a crystal spear. Tuesday morning. I stood in their marble lobby at 9:55 a.m., visitor badge clipped to my jacket, having been summoned by Dana for what she called an essential clarification meeting. Martin didn't know I was there. He'd assumed his triumphant email had closed the deal, that Helios was already preparing to sign on the dotted line. He was probably in his office right now, calculating his bonus based on the inflated projections. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt like ascending to a courtroom, where I'd be both witness and evidence. Dana's assistant, Marcus, greeted me with knowing sympathy. "They're in the Roosevelt room," he said, leading me down a hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. The Roosevelt room was Helios's main conference space, floor-to-ceiling windows, a table that could seat 30, and an atmosphere that whispered power in 12 different languages. Dana sat at the head, flanked by Sarah Martinez and Thomas Park. James Worthington was there too. Legal pad at the ready. They'd also brought in 2 people I didn't recognize, forensic accountants, based on the spreadsheets covering their section of the table. "Claire," Dana stood, professional but warm. "Thank you for coming." I took the seat she indicated, directly across from a projection screen showing Martin's deck slide 14, the one promising 30% returns with 0 documentation. "We have concerns," Dana began without preamble. "The presentation yesterday contained projections that differ significantly from historical patterns we've seen in your firm's work. Specifically, your work." Sarah leaned forward. "In 5 years of collaboration, you've never once failed to include a comprehensive risk assessment. Yesterday's presentation had 3 bullet points that essentially said, 'Minimal risk expected.' That's not analysis. That's wishful thinking." "I understand your concerns," I said carefully, aware that everything here could be subpoenaed if this went legal. "I'm not able to speak to Mr. Keaton's methodology, as I wasn't involved in the final preparation of these materials." "But you prepared the initial analysis?" Thomas asked. "I prepared an analysis. Whether it was used in yesterday's presentation is something you'd need to discuss with Mr. Keaton." Dana's eyes sharpened. "Claire, we're not recording this conversation. This is off the record. Colleague to colleague. Did Martin Keaton materially alter your work?" I met her gaze steadily. "I can tell you that I maintain comprehensive records of all my analyses, including timestamps, methodologies, and revision histories. If Northwind's leadership requests that documentation to clarify any confusion, I would be happy to provide it." James Worthington stopped writing. "Are you saying documentation exists that contradicts yesterday's presentation?" "I'm saying I keep thorough records. What those records might show would depend on what specific questions were being asked." The room fell silent. Through the windows, Manhattan stretched out below us, indifferent to the small drama playing out in this tower. Dana pulled out her phone and typed something quickly. "I'm requesting a formal audit of the Helios proposal from Richard directly. We need to see the original analysis, all drafts, all communications." My phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. "Martin just got called to Richard's office. He looks confused." "There's something else," Sarah said, sliding a paper across the table to me. It was a printout of an email, not one I'd seen before. "Martin sent this to our junior associates after yesterday's meeting, suggesting they could bypass senior leadership and work directly with him on creative financing solutions. He's trying to poach our people while pitching us fraudulent projections." I read it twice, my disgust carefully controlled. "That's inappropriate." "It's more than inappropriate," James said. "It's potentially tortious interference. Combined with the questionable projections, we're looking at a pattern of behavior that could expose both our firms to significant liability." Dana stood, signaling the meeting's end. "Claire, I know you're in a difficult position, but I need you to know that when this shakes out, and it will shake out, Helios values integrity over everything else. We remember who tells us the truth, even when it's complicated." The words hung in the air like a promise, or maybe a lifeline. As I walked back through the lobby, my phone exploded with messages. "Jessica. All hands meeting called for 2 p.m. David from compliance. Need to talk ASAP. 3 missed calls from Martin." I stepped onto the street, Manhattan's chaos swirling around me, and called Martin back. "Where the hell are you?" he barked without preamble. "Following up on some analysis questions from yesterday's meeting," I said truthfully. What questions I told them, everything was perfect. Dana seemed totally on board. The delusion was almost pitiable. "I'm sure it will all work out exactly as it should. Get back here. Richard wants to see the Helios files, all of them, including your drafts." "Of course, I have everything thoroughly documented." A pause, then, quieter. "What do you mean?" "Everything, every draft, every revision, every email discussing changes to the analysis, standard protocol. You emphasized the importance of documentation in your first all hands. Remember, leave no stone unturned, I believe you said." The silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Finally, "Just get back here." I ended the call and stood on the sidewalk, watching the city move around me. In my bag was a USB drive containing every piece of evidence needed to show exactly how Martin had transformed my careful analysis into his reckless fiction. In the Helios Tower behind me, Dana was probably already on the phone with Richard, asking pointed questions that Martin couldn't answer. The presentation that was supposed to be his triumph was about to become his undoing. He just didn't know it yet, but standing there in the Manhattan morning, I could feel the tremor before the earthquake, that moment when the ground starts to shift but hasn't yet opened up. I hailed a cab, gave the driver Northwind's address, and prepared to watch Martin Keaton learn what happened when you built your castle on someone else's foundation, especially when that someone kept the blueprints. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes Manhattan look like a movie set. I'd gotten to the office at 7 a.m., earlier than usual, to find Martin already there, pacing his office like a caged predator. Through the glass walls, I could see him rehearsing something, gesturing at an invisible audience. At 8:47 a.m., he sent the email that would destroy him. I watched it land in my inbox, part of a company-wide distribution list titled Helios Success and Next Steps. The timestamp would later prove crucial, 8:47:23 a.m. Est, Wednesday, October 18th, every second documented, every recipient recorded. The email was classic Martin self-congratulatory, dismissive of outdated concerns, and absolutely certain that Helios was ready to sign, but buried in his corporate speak was something else: his response to what he thought was a private message from his assistant, Kelly, asking about the meeting with Richard. Except he'd hit reply all. The message read, Kelly Richards being paranoid about the Helios numbers. Dana Whitmore is too conservative to understand visionary projections typical of her generation, stuck in 2008 crisis mode. I had to polish the data to make it compelling. Sometimes you have to sell the dream, not the reality. These risk-averse